We are week 4 and Ecclesiastes chapter 4. It's a short chapter, but it's very focused. You kind of have to read it in the context of where we've been headed so far, right? Because we left off last week talking about how everything has its time, and yet time itself is a troublesome topic. And what we do fits within God's timing, and yet we never really quite grasp what he has done, what he is doing. And he ended at the end of what we know of as chapter 3, talking about injustice. And how, God works to judge the righteous and the wicked. And there's a time for that, but he's never really quite sure when that time is, because he's never really sure that there's anything after death. Well, he picks up again, at the beginning of chapter 4. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors, there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought, the dead who are already dead, more fortunate than the living who are still alive, but better than both is he who has not yet been, and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. And then I saw that all toil and all skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This is vanity and a striving after the wind. The fool folds his hands, eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after the wind. This is where we start in the chapter. Everything else here sort of develops that thought. But think about the connection between this idea that all the work that we pursue and the skills we develop coming from envy, right? If you watch a lot of those crime dramas, mysteries, and things like that, you know that 2 of the most common motives for crime, and this is drawn from real life, are financial, envy of someone else's possessions, or sexual, envy of other persons. We want what someone else has, and we don't, right? The cliche, grass is always greener, right? We always think what we don't have is better than what we have. And a lot of times this is the major motive behind the effort we put in. And I know there are some people who just do what they do because they love it so much. But in my own experience, I haven't met that many people who are like that. Most people work so that they can do something else. That's been my experience. And you think about what ambition leads you to. You want something. Work is the means to that. And how easily oppression can arise out of ambition. You see, oppression doesn't spring simply from some people having and other people not having. Where it comes from is each one showing no concern for anything but his or her own gain. And we can take this in an individual sense, but we can also take it, in a familial sense. I want my family to have. The common cause of strife between generations is often parents saying, well, I want you to have what I never had, but basically meaning I want to have that through you. And the younger generation will often say, but that's not what I want to have. You see, when we want something, we tend to lose sight of the journey to get that something. And sometimes we do it without realizing it. Not everyone falls into that, I don't care who I have to trample down in order to get, right? Not everyone does that. Sometimes they just say, I am so focused on getting that I might not even notice trampling somebody. But much of the law, if you go back to Exodus, Leviticus, much of the law deals with preventing people from oppressing their neighbor, from oppressing the weak and the vulnerable. A couple of examples I can show you. Exodus 22. Now, this is, you have to remember, Exodus 20 was the actual Decalogue, no other gods before me, don't take the name Lord in vain, all these sort of things. So it's really close up after that the law starts to speak about how we are to treat our neighbor in terms of what they have and we don't. The entirety of chapter 22, in fact, in Exodus, talks about reparations for theft, for property damage, for what we might say rules for safe borrowing. You look at chapter 22, verse 21, though, you start into, you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, because you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Even things, if you lend to any of my people among you who's poor, right? Your neighbor who is poor, if you lend money, don't be like the money lenders and exact interest. Even if you take his coat in pledge, return it to him before the sun goes down. That's his only covering. And in what else shall he sleep? We're talking about people who are so poor, all they have to barter with are the clothes they're wearing. And he says, that's doable, but you make sure he has that at night so he stays warm. Leviticus, right? Often a troubling and tedious book to read through, is also full of these kind of things. Chapter 6, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security, or through robbery, or if he has oppressed his neighbor or has found something lost and lied about it, swearing falsely, any of all the things that people will do and sin thereby, if he has sinned and realized his guilt and will restore what he took by robbery, or what he got by oppression, or the deposit that was committed to him, or the lost thing that he found, he restores it in full and adds a fifth to it and give it to him to whom it belongs on the day, right? So it's very detailed. This is how you are to behave. And if you fail, this is how you are to make up for it. And if you don't make up for it, this is what will happen to you. The law is very concerned. You can't oppress even outsiders, the sojourners, because you were one once. You're not even allowed to oppress your own livestock or your land. Everything has to have its Sabbath rest. So if you think about it, throughout history, there are entirely too many examples of all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And, you know, it's like, you know what? He's already said that enjoying the actual process of work is the only good that one gains from it. And if you're only focused on the end, on what you anticipate you will collect once you've done all the work, you've lost track of that, and you've lost the gift of it that God gives. And he ends up, right? Envy is meaningless. Vanity is striving after the wind. Because what do we find when we do get that thing that somebody else had that looked so good? Well, he's already shown us that way back chapter 2. He was talking about how he's going to indulge himself. He was going to pursue whatever his heart desired. He was never going to deny himself anything. And when he got to the end, he's like, this has no meaning either. It doesn't satisfy. So what? Why do we do it? Before we move to the next section, I want to point out something. This is one of those passages that make people doubt that this really was Solomon writing, because you have to think who Solomon was. He was not just king over Israel, but he had a realm that stretched proverbially from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates River. And if he's seeing oppressions done under the sun and no one can stop it, if he can't stop it, who can? Now, we do know that the people felt oppressed under Solomon's reign. We know this because of what they said to his son Rehoboam. But anyway, this is one of those points where they say that this royal Solomonic persona sort of breaks down a little bit. Now, whether you agree with that or not, there's this repetition of the word comfort. They had no one to comfort them. There was no one to comfort them. And this is why he says, right, the ones who have not yet been born have it the best. Because, right, the ones who are alive are the ones who are suffering the oppression. The ones who are dead at least have gotten through the oppression, but they still have the scars. But this word comfort in the Hebrew, menahem, it's not that sort of like you come up to somebody and you sympathize with them. I'm sorry this happened to you. It's not sympathizing. It's actively easing suffering. And when I read this, there was no one to comfort them, the first thing that popped into my head actually was Isaiah chapter 63. That image of the Messiah arriving as victorious conqueror. And you look at verse 5 and it says, I looked, but there was no one to help. I was appalled, but there was no one to uphold. So my own arm brought me salvation, and my wrath upheld me. It's this idea that The Messiah sees no one to rescue his people. No one stands up against their enemy. And so he himself steps in to bring salvation. Now, there's somewhere that you can tie in the rest of Scripture to this passage of Ecclesiastes, because Koheles sees no one to ease the suffering of the oppressed. But Scripture promises someone will come. Even if no one in this world is able or willing to stand up against the greatest of oppression, which he's been talking about all this time, the idea that it doesn't matter what you do, you still die. But the Messiah comes, and he steps in to provide salvation. Indeed, to put death to death. But Koheles says, right, we've looked at this, and this workaholic ambition leads only really to, it comes from envy and it leads to oppression in the end, if you trace it through its natural course. So what then? What about not working at all? Well, he disposes of that very briefly in verse 5. The fool folds his hands, right? Refuses to work, does nothing, and eats his own flesh, right? It's a vivid and rather gruesome analogy for, this idea of no toil at all is not only folly, it's also unsustainable, like trying to be one's own food source. Doesn't happen. But then he says, better. And of course, when we see him say better, you keep kind of little antenna goes up. A handful of quietness, one handful of quietness, then 2 hands full of toil and striving after wind. So no hands, folly, unsustainable. 2 hands, grasping, is just toil and meaninglessness. But 1 hand with a sufficiency is better. It's that called happy medium. Because, and he doesn't actually say in so many words, but the context suggests that 1 hand for work leaves the other hand free to grasp someone else's hand. And he supports this idea with an anecdote and a series of sort of analogies of community, right? So comparison, I saw, again, vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there's no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches. So that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? See, he's not enjoying the journey himself. And he doesn't even have that sort of secondary satisfaction of knowing that he's benefiting people he loves. He's got no one. And yet he's so fixated, he never asks himself, why am I doing this? He never sits back and reflects. This also is vanity and an unhappy business. So that's the one side. That's that 2 hands full of toil striving after the wind. Here's the 1 hand with quietness. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, 1 will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they keep warm. But how can 1 keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. So 3 things. Falling down. I was thinking about the very familiar example of icy sidewalks. And one person falls down, it's like, like trying to get any kind of traction to get over to the grass so that they at least have something they can grab onto. If you have two people, at least you've got some propulsion. Even if you've both fallen on the same patch of ice, you could sort of push each other until you're somewhere more stable. So falling down or keeping warm. Again, right? Outdoor weather here. In the original audience, they would have known that the days being warm didn't mean that the nights were also warm. In fact, in the desert, nights can be bitterly cold. And of course, living in the north, you do learn that cold is dangerous. So keeping warm is important. And it's very hard to do that when you're by yourself. You don't really dare sleep. But if there are two of you, at least you can, like, back to back, try to, keep each other warm. And then defense. We are, of course, of the culture of the rugged individual who takes a stand and more often than not dies heroically. Right? But successful defense really depends on numbers. 1, not good. 2, better. 3, there you've got something. At least then you can take turns resting and keeping watch. And this too, right, should tie you to the New Testament in that promise. Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in their midst. Not to say that the Spirit does not come to visit us in our solitude. But 2 or 3 is much safer. Because we keep each other accountable. And we watch each other's weak points. So, you see, he's working out a line of thought here. Looking for better. Koheles never really seems to reach best. It seems like he doesn't even think that there could possibly be a best because everything ends in death. But better. He's looking for what's better. What is, like we started out, what makes a decent life? And he ends up with this story. This is verses 13 through 16. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. Now, he doesn't give names. We don't know if this is a real story or if this is one of those object lesson type stories. But doesn't this sound a bit like Joseph? He went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. And I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was standing in the king's place, and there was no end of all the people, of all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. You think about Joseph, right? Sold as a slave. Then, as a slave, unjustly committed to prison. From prison, elevated to second highest after Pharaoh. And leading not just Egypt, but the surrounding nations through the worst famine they had ever seen. And yet, what is it we find at the beginning of Exodus? There arose another Pharaoh who did not know about Joseph. Joseph had done all these marvelous things, had saved his family, the people of Israel, that core that would become a great nation. people of God's promise. It saved them from the famine, brought them into Egypt. But once he was gone, no one remembered. And there were the people of Israel in Egypt. Strangers, slaves then, sojourners in a land where they were not necessarily welcome, but put to use, you might say, oppressed, no power on their side. Is this a success story that Koheleth is telling? This poor and wise youth who went from prison to the throne, from poor to rich, and leading many, one might think celebrated in his own time. Is this a success story? And the answer is actually, for Koheleth, yes. This is how success always ends. Because no matter who you are, how much fame you acquire, no matter how much wealth, property, people, in the end, once you're gone, the attention moves on. Someone else inherits what you've collected. And surely this also is vanity and striving after the wind. That's every success story in a nutshell. Celebrated, right? Everybody loves a good rags to riches success story. But they all end the same way. So to be honest, if you're not enjoying the journey, Koheleth says, why are you bothering? You need to definitely reassess your priorities. Because if you're looking for fame, you might have it for a minute. You'll definitely lose it eventually. Like I said, those year-end New Year's recaps are always a bit of a shock because you're like, wow, that was this year. I thought that was a lot longer ago. I had forgotten about that person a long time ago. But yet, right, we still have that formula, better. Better was. Better than. Because Koheleth always has an opinion on what's better, and wisdom, whatever its vessel, poor youth, wisdom makes that person always better, right? It's always better than folly. But better, again, still isn't best. And that's the troubling part of Ecclesiastes, because where is the best? If it isn't in ambition, if it isn't in, maybe it's in, I don't know, religion. That's what we say, right? That the best is to be close to God. Well, he's going to deal with that next week, too. In fact, he's going to deal with that quite a bit. And you're going to see better than quite a lot. But keep an eye out. Do you ever see him say, this is the best? This is it. So next week, right, chapter 5. Should be pretty simple. Doesn't mean it's easy.